purposes to the video that is going to be shown to you now. The first one is for Choral Studies 2 students who are studying the works by Peter Louis van Dijk called Horizons, and also the South African traditional song by Tickle. The second purpose is for those of you, all Choral Studies students, who have to present a introduction to a piece of music that you have been given to study. You will see now how I am going to present two composers' music. You'll see what I do so that perhaps you can do something similar when you present the piece of music that you have been given to work on. So let us begin. We're going to look at a piece of music by Peter Louis van Dijk, a South African composer and conductor. He was born in Rotterdam in Holland in 1953 into a musical family. His grandfather was an organist and composer, and his father was a violinist. Now, young Peter Louis was a fantastic musician from a very early age. He learned to play all sorts of instruments, but in particular, he's excellent in recorder, piano, guitar, viola, and cello. For anybody, that's quite a feat, because for example, I can only play 2 instruments, but imagine being able to play 5 instruments really, really well. Besides being a good performer, he started composing at the age of 9, a very, very young age. He wrote his first opera with both the music and the libretto. That's quite unusual when somebody writes the music and the words together. It was called The Contract, and he wrote it at the tender age of 19. Some of you will be 19 if you're in your first year. Would you be able to write an opera? Well, it will be interesting to see what kind of music comes out of your minds. Then, he trained as a music teacher, and he taught in and around Cape Town, both in high schools and at several universities, UCT and UWC. He got his B.Mus degree in 1983, and much later the D.Mus, or Doctor of Music degree, in 2004. He's very much alive. He's still living in Port Elizabeth, and he works as a freelance composer and educator. He sometimes teaches, for example, at Rhodes University, composition and some other subjects. So, what is unique about the compositional character of Peter Louis van Dijk? What I noticed earlier, as I told you earlier, is that he often writes both the text or the lyrics and the music for his compositions, and that sets him apart from most composers who only write the music. They would choose the text from somewhere else. What is also interesting is that he chooses local topics for his compositions. One of his great strengths is that he likes to promote the plight of the San people. You'll know that the San people are one of the smallest cultural groups in South Africa at the moment, yet they are the original people who lived in South Africa. So even though they're smallest, they've been living in South Africa for the longest. So his piece, Horizons, for example, is a look at how San people have been maligned in our contemporary and ancient society. Then he also uses conventional South African city life in some of his compositions. So one of his one-act operas, for example, looks at young people in a taxi, and the opera singers are the singers in the taxi, and the taxi does all sorts of interesting things, and they comment about it while they are singing in the taxi. Sometimes he includes musical humor. He's got quite a good sense of humor himself, and that comes through in his music. He integrates interesting compositional techniques into his choral works. So, for example, in this piece that you have been listening to called Horizons, you will have noticed that there's a lot of body percussion, clicking of fingers, clapping of hands, stamping of feet. But then there are also vocalized non-musical sounds, things like tss or which he incorporates as a part of the vocal musical instrument. Also, he generally operates in a tonal context. That means he uses scales of the minor scale, the major scale, sometimes modes. Although sometimes his style can display elements of advanced chromaticism and sometimes atonality. Atonality means that there's no key at all. So it's not random, but certainly it's not following any conventional key. So one of his Christmas carols, for example, and his San Gloria have times where they go into atonal sections. His music tends to be very rhythmically strong, and you will have noticed that when you listened to the pieces of music, or the piece of music Horizons, that there is a strong rhythmic drive behind his music. That is characteristic of many of his pieces. Sometimes, though, this strength of rhythm, or the many different strands of rhythm that happen at the same time, create quite a dense texture, which means it's quite difficult to listen to. Now, Horizons. When we look at the piece Horizons, we need to see what kind of context it comes from. It was written for a group of singers called the King's Singers. They are a British singing group, and they consist of 6 male singers, no more, no less, all male singers. 2 countertenors, 1 tenor, 2 baritones, and 1 bass. Just in case you're not sure what a countertenor is, it's a tenor who sings in his falsetto range, so very high. It can sound like a very soft soprano voice. But it has quite a lot of power in the octave between middle C and top C, so they can get quite a lot of power just in that particular part of their voice, which a real soprano can't get. This piece was originally intended, therefore, for 1 voice per part. So even though it's now arranged, or the version that you were listening to is arranged for soprano, alto, tenor, tenor, baritone, and bass, it was originally for countertenor, countertenor, tenor, baritone, baritone, and bass. Just 1 person per part, 6 people. Now, when bigger groups are performing this piece, you need to be aware that there will probably be balance issues. And particularly, you will have heard in the recording that you were listening to that sometimes the tenor that was singing the solo part gets lost in the very dense texture of clapping, clicking, and singing at the same time. So sometimes you've got to be very careful that the choir is settling down a little bit so that you can hear the words of the tenor soloist. Also, the original voice structure, and here I'm particularly referring to the countertenors, the 2 countertenors which have quite a strong range between middle C and the C just above that, accounts for why it is so difficult for sopranos, female sopranos, to sing the part. Usually a female soprano, the strength of her voice is actually above the C, not middle C, but the C above that. From C up all the way to top C is where a soprano's strength is greatest, but the octave below that is usually where they are quite soft, or where their tone is not as strong. Now, most of the piece for the sopranos is in that lower octave between middle C and the C just above it, which means that it's difficult for them to get any power there. So that's just one thing that you need to remember when you are teaching this to your sopranos. Then, also, as I mentioned before, the first tenor part, which has quite a lot of the text of the piece, needs to have a strong singer, or if you need several singers to do that solo part. Otherwise, the diction doesn't come across well, and we can't hear the words. The words, as you will have found, are exceptionally beautiful because they highlight aspects of San culture which are not always evident to us when we think about San culture and its beautiful stories. So just keep that in mind. You want to be able to hear the text all the way through. Now, I want you on your own to read the whole text, but I'm just going to give you here a little bit of a analysis of the text itself. There are 3 verses. Each of them start with a characteristic lullaby feel. It starts, "Sleep, my springbok baby." Each of the verses starts like that. Notice that there are regular references to nature and allusions to San culture. So, for example, in the first verse, we're talking about rain and water. But in particular for the San culture, it is about the rain cow. If you've ever looked at a huge cloud that's heavy with water on the horizon, it does look a bit like a cow approaching you. And that comes very much part of the metaphoric language. Then in the second verse, there is a call to the hunting star, or to the sunshine, to blind the eland so that the eland won't see the hunter approaching, ready to kill him for food. So just keep that in mind, the hunting star as a sign of the sun. The third verse describes the white settlers arriving in their ships and then destroying San culture, not always by killing, and there was a lot of killing involved though too, but also simply by eliminating San culture. So those are the 3 verses. One is about water, so that they can drink because they are thirsty. The second is about food because they are hungry. And it includes, in particular, the eland. And if you've ever seen pictures of sand paintings, there's often a picture of an eland or several eland. It was a sacred animal in a sense. Then the third, also in a lot of drawings or paintings, rock paintings, you will see that there are paintings of ships, of Western ships coming with white settlers on them. The Sand people were very interested in the settlers, and even though they were very generous to the white settlers weren't as generous to them in return. The third verse is particularly poignant or sad because it is a reminder of how the curious San and Khoikhoi people were often maligned just because they were the local inhabitants. Sometimes they were even shot just because they were misunderstood. One of the questions one wants to ask of a text like this, is it a political statement in favor of the most marginalized local culture group in South Africa? That's one question you could ask, but another is, how is it that a white man whose descendants or forebears themselves were among those who destroyed sand culture, writing about sand culture now in the contemporary world? Sometimes a little bit of a distance there, but it shows how people can change over many generations. Now, let's go and analyze the music itself. You will find copies of the music so that you can check it for yourself as an attachment alongside this video so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. You will have heard in the recording that there's lots of body percussion, the finger snaps, the clapping. But I'd like to ask you, how does this assist in creating the atmosphere of the piece? Remember, we're talking about sand culture. You will have seen, though, that there is a regular use of the rhythm 2 against 3. So you'll have quavers in the one section and triplets in the other, superimposed on each other, 2 against 3. That is a very characteristic rhythmic device of the Sand people. Not only the Sand people, actually, but of all Nguni people in South Africa and also of Tswana and Sotho people. So if you look carefully at bar 38 to 46, for example, you'll find the 2 against 3 really coming out strongly, but it comes out strongly throughout the whole piece. One of the things you need to remember about that body percussion of the 2 and 3, clapping and clicking, is that it can become overwhelming and overwhelm the music itself. If you've got a big choir, let's say you're dealing with more than 30 people in your choir, and they're all clapping like that, it's soon going to overwhelm the text, so you're not going to be able to hear the text. My recommendation is to use 2 fingers on the hand, which is much softer, so that you can still hear the words of the music, but have the percussion at the same time. Remember, the piece was written for 6 people, not 30 or 40 people. So it's intended that the balance will sort itself out simply because there is only one person clapping or one person clicking. So you've just got to make sure that that balances out if you perform this piece. Now, also look at the way that the composer uses the voice itself as a percussion instrument. So if you were to look at bar 30, for example, or 31, sorry, bar 31, the altos make a sound chick, chick, and they go like this, chick, 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 as though you're using a shaker. So you're trying to make the sound with your voice of a percussion instrument. Also, you'll find that the basses in bar 30 are trying to imitate a marimba. Ding, 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 ding. Imagine yourself playing on a marimba. That's what you're trying to do. But even more profound is later on in the music in bars 111 to bar 112, is where the composer puts in the sounds of a military band, brass instruments, trumpet, ding, 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 ding. That's the kind of sound that he wants. And also bum, 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 of a trombone, for example, all using the voice to imitate instruments. You might want to ask yourself, why does the composer place a military band with the words at that point? The military band appears in verse 3, which is talking about white settlers coming on their ships. If you have listened to the music before that, it's been trying to evoke the sounds of the Sand people, a very distinct type of musical world. Then he places a military band, a very Western sound, in this next section. It's almost like 2 sound worlds are crashing into each other. And you'll see that that dissonance that creates it is almost like a statement in itself. Then another thing which he uses quite regularly throughout the piece is a technique called portamento, or sometimes abbreviated to port. That is when you go la, like that. It's like a glissando. Instead of going la, 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 it just goes la. Also, there are a lot of grace notes. Grace notes are those small little notes next to the main note, sometimes a little bit above or sometimes below. That's, if you to perform it, goes ah, ah, ah. It's the short note just before the main note. You'll know that in traditional music in South Africa, grace notes form an integral part of singing, as does portamento. So you often at the end of a phrase get somebody go la, 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 something like that. Okay, that's very characteristic of our own local styles here in South Africa. You'll find those in bars 74 and 75. So these are all of the elements that come together in the compositional style. On one side, trying to show that there is a local music tradition in South Africa, but that another one came from outside, from Europe. They crashed into each other and created almost a hybrid type of music, which he tries to show towards the end of this piece called Horizons. Then, if we look at the melodic contours, that is how the melodies are structured, you'll see that the tenor solo melodies throughout the piece almost always start up high and gradually migrate lower. This is also a common characteristic of South African vocal melodies. They almost always start high and move lower. And actually, our local languages are designed to accommodate that effect as well. Then, Van Dyk uses a common compositional technique in Horizons, which creates a very interesting effect in this context. You'll notice if you look at the soprano part and the second tenor parts between bars 38 and 46, that there is something called a canon. You all know what a canon is, or a round, and this is a canon at the octave. If you look at that same section in bars 38 to 46, and this time look at the soprano and alto parts, you'll find that there are a large number of perfect fourth and perfect fifth intervals. That creates quite a hollow, harmonic sound. If you're very familiar with South African traditional music of the Xhosa and the Zulu and the Sotho, you'll know that they use those hollow sounding perfect fourths and fifths regularly when they harmonize their music. So again, there's another allusion to our local music making traditions. Now, if we were to ask some questions of the composer, and we could ask to him, we could write to him and say, we'd like to ask you some questions about your piece Horizons. These are the kind of questions I would ask him. I'd say, you have written several pieces which are inspired in some way by the San people. Would you consider yourself an advocate of the San people and their plight during the colonial conquest and in contemporary South Africa? What I'm really saying is, why are you writing about the San people? You are a white man. How is it that you are so passionate about San culture? He may be able to give us a very interesting answer, and that would be of interest to us as we perform the piece. Then we would ask, did San traditional folklore inspire the text? And if it did, in what way did it inspire the text? If you've read through all of the words, you will have seen that there are many allusions to San culture. Where did Pieter Louis van Dyk get this information from? Was he reading some San stories? Or had he been educated in San folklore? It would be interesting to find out, because that would give us a clue as to how the text was put together. Then, when preparing Horizons and his other great piece about the San people called San Gloria, was he influenced in any way by traditional San music-making techniques and characteristics? Or did the rhythms and melodies which he uses in those pieces just come naturally to him? Was he perhaps listening to a lot of San music that has been recorded and preserved? Or did he actively go out and study the techniques in an academic way? Then the final question I would ask is related to musical history itself, because usually music is written in a context. In the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, there were a number of South African and international composers who were experimenting with African music techniques. And they were trying to include it into the way that they composed the music. If you consider, for example, a piece called Mantis by Hans Rosenskroon, he uses the idea of the praying mantis as a sacred animal for the San as a basis for the piece of music that he wrote for that same name. He was very much influenced by San folklore, but the music that he produced didn't sound anything like San music. On the other hand, there was an ethnomusicologist called David Fanshawe who was studying music of East and North Africa and recording it and then notating it. And while he was notating it, he thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I wrote a piece that had similar sounds as these African particular pieces, but written for Western instruments and for Western voices. And so he created a piece called African Sanctus, which is very, very deeply rooted in African styles of music. So I would ask Peter Louis van Dijk, did any of the works written by South Africans or by international composers that are related to Africa in some way inspire or influence you at the time that he composed Horizons and San Gloria? That in itself would give us the genesis of the piece of music that we were dealing with and the way that we interpret it. Now let's move to Bawo Tickle Somandla, and you'll find a recording of this and the sheet music itself alongside this video on Moodle. So this piece of music was first made popular in the 1980s by Jabulani Mazibuko's Soweto Teachers Choir. That choir heard the song first performed in a school for disabled children in Umtata while they were there on a tour in the Eastern Cape. They learnt the song from the children and then took it back with them to Soweto and began performing it there. It very quickly became popular. Nobody actually knows who composed the song, and we don't even know if it was one composer or if it was composed by a group of people. Perhaps the children themselves had actually composed the song. The four-part version that most people are familiar with today is actually an arrangement by Mzilikazi Khumalo. But if you think of the children who were singing it, probably all upper voices, so sopranos and altos, but the version that we are used to has got bass, tenor, alto and soprano parts. Usually when we talk about Bawo Tickle Somandla, it's actually classed as a quasi-religious folk song. Quasi means it's like. So it's like a religious song, but it's not necessarily a religious song. And it's a folk song because we don't know who actually composed it. It's just there. Everybody knows it, but we don't know exactly where it comes from. Some people have interpreted the song as a protest song, a protest against apartheid. Remember, this was in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly made famous in the 1980s, just when apartheid was at its height. So, of course, many people, when they heard the words Senzeni na, which is very much in the Bawo Tickle Somandla, they were saying, why us? Why us? Why? Because we are black. So it could be that, but it could be also some other things. If you read through the text, you will see that the text has very strong allusions to the passion narratives or the crucifixion narratives of the Christian Gospels, where Jesus, just before his betrayal by Judas, asks God to take this cup from him. And you'll know the text, there are allusions to take this cup from us. This is a very direct reference to the passion stories from the Christian Gospels. Now, I cannot be sure, but I am surmising that the piece may have originally been designed to be sung during Holy Week, that is the week just before Easter, and more specifically for Maundy Thursday or Good Friday. I say Good Friday because the words Azi Senzeni na strongly recall the words from the ancient Good Friday hymn called The Reproaches. Some of you may be familiar with that text in your own home language, but in English it says, "What have I done to you, my people?" And those words are put into Jesus' mouth. What have I done to you that you should crucify me? You can hear the resonance between what have I done and Azi Senzeni na. So I asked this question, were the children who originally sang this piece speaking of their own sorrows at being disabled? Or were they simply singing a hymn-like song which they knew from their churches? Or do you think the children themselves were intending this song to be a protest against apartheid? Unfortunately, we will never know that unless we can track down those children, ask them, where did you learn this song and why was it composed? Perhaps that can be something that you one day do as a research project in a master's or PhD degree. Now, let's look at the structure of the piece, some points of interest. The piece as we have received it through Mzilikazi Khumalo's arrangement is in A-B-A form. That means ternary form. So there's an A section, a contrasting B section, and then the A section returns at the end. Bars 1 to 63 is the A section. Bar B, the B section is 64 to 79, and then the A section returns from bar 80 and to the end. But if you use the repeat sections that are offered as an optional extra, the structure becomes A, B, A, B, A. So it can be quite a long song if you want it to be. What's interesting about it, and which makes it very characteristic of our traditional music or traditional folk songs in Xhosa tradition, is the layered texture of the piece. So if you know the arrangement, it starts with the basses. Bawo Xhosa mandla. They're singing on their own. Not long after that come the sopranos. Up in the top. And then later on, the altos come in, and then after that, the tenors follow the altos in those same words. So what we've got there is 4 parts coming in one after each other. But each of the parts is quite unique. If you listen to them, they have their own rhythmic and melodic feeling. The only 2 that are really related are the alto and tenor voices, and they resemble a very much hymn-like tune. So it sounds like a hymn being sung. But the bass and the soprano parts, which undergird and top the part of music, are quite different to hymns. They're much more bouncy in their feel. This is called a polyphonic texture. It means that the bass, the soprano, and the altos and tenors are singing quite distinct parts of music which are not really related to each other, but complement each other quite well in the overall piece. So this piece is polyphonic. Also, what is quite interesting to note is something that often happens in local traditional music is something called parallel movement. If you look at the alto and tenor voices, which are singing at the same time, you'll see that they are always moving in parallel movement. So if the alto goes up, so does the tenor. If it goes down, so does the tenor. They're always moving together in parallel movement. This is very similar to if you've ever been to a township or a rural church and you've listened to the hymns when they're being sung by the congregation. You'll notice that the harmonizations that are being used are also often parallel harmonies. What is also something that you can highlight is that there are 2 different types of rhythmic devices which are used. One is called ostinato. If you don't know what ostinato means it keeps on repeating itself. So if you think of the bass part, for example, that bass part just keeps on repeating over and over. That's called an ostinato. The soprano part is also an ostinato, but it's using a very different kind of text and also a very different type of melody. In contrast to that, you have the alto and tenor voices, which are singing music which is different all the way through. It's like a hymn being sung throughout. It's not being repeated over and over like the bass and the soprano parts. What I find particularly interesting coming from a Western musical perspective is that even though the words are so heartfelt and sad, the major mode is used throughout. So the song is in the major key. Usually, if you were setting a text like this in Western music, it would be linked with the minor key. But there again, if you listen to a song like Senzeni Na, also a struggle song, it also, even though it's such a song describing such sadness and emotion, is also in the major mode rather than the minor mode. Perhaps this is a distinction between Western and African music that is inherent and which is part of culture. So that is all that I need to say to you about these two pieces. This gives you an introduction into our local music, both from the Western side and from our more local traditional side. You'll find that we are going to learn quite a lot about the different types of music, both from white composers and black composers. And those of you who have watched this video to see how to create a kind of a presentation which you will give in class, then please remember these things. If you are given a piece by a composer, don't spend too much time telling us about the composer. You'll notice that I just gave a short introduction to the composer Peter Louis van Dijk. Of more interest to me is how the piece itself works. How is it divided into sections? How do the melodies work? How do the rhythms work? Those are the kind of things that I'm interested in. If you need to, go back to the beginning of this video and watch it again to see how I've structured all of the information that I've given you, because this is the kind of thing that I'd be expecting from you when you give your own presentations.